Hello and welcome to our final set of slides on stakeholder engagement. I hope you've been enjoying the lecture series so far. This one brings us to the end of our journey on stakeholder engagement. And to start off, all right, so let's recap where we are in the process. We started off by looking at the importance of identifying your stakeholders. So we said that the first step is to get an understanding of who your stakeholders are. So in order to do that, we looked at the definition of stakeholder engagement and the definition of a stakeholder. And we said that a stakeholder is essentially an organization or a person, an individual that has a stake or an interest in your organization. We said that that stake or interest needs to be meaningful, it needs to be significant from the perspective of either being able to affect your organization or be affected by your organization. And from that, on that basis, we then looked at the framework that is provided by the International Integrated Reporting Council. And in that framework, they divide stakeholders into two types: your primary stakeholders and your secondary stakeholders. Your primary stakeholders being those that affect your organization more directly, such as your customers, your suppliers, your employees. Typically, those stakeholders that have a direct impact or that you have a direct impact on. We then looked at your secondary stakeholders, which are a little bit more broader. The stakeholders that, for instance, have a more nuanced effect or stake in your organization. So we looked at, for instance, the government, we looked at regulatory bodies, we looked at the type of private interest groups or context-specific interest groups that would be interested in the type of work you're doing and how your work is affecting their goals or their values, etc. We then said that once we've got an understanding of who your stakeholders are, we need to analyze their interests and get an understanding of what their interests actually entail. And their interests could vary from having very direct, strong interest in your organization, or indirect interests, which are a little bit more subtle. And so we looked at a table with a number of different factors, and we looked at the type of interest that an organization could have within your organization, and we broke down some of them. For instance, financial interests, environmental interests, social interests, and those are some of the sort of elements that you could consider when identifying and analyzing the interest that another organization has in your organization. And then we moved on to the so-called power interest matrix. And we said once we've got an understanding of what interest an organization or an individual has within your organization, we then need to kind of rank those interests and the associated power as well. So there are certain organizations that have a lot of power over your organization. There are those that have a lesser amount of power, a great amount of influence, a less amount of influence. And we have this matrix then which then allows us to position your stakeholders in a way that enables you to formulate the appropriate communication strategies. So we looked at the, we looked at the power interest grid, and we said that essentially your stakeholders could form one of, or could fit into essentially one of four different areas. So let's start off with those stakeholders that have a low interest and low power. All right. So the communication strategy that emerges from your stakeholders that have low interest and low levels of power is a more passive approach. Okay. So remember, when you formulate a communication strategy on how to deal with your stakeholders, it's largely driven by experience and guidelines, but there are no foolproof scientific methods that always work 100%. And so many companies get this wrong. And the result of having a good or to result in having a good communication strategy requires a lot of work, a lot of reflection, a lot of understanding around who your stakeholders are and understanding realism of being connected to those stakeholders, so without formulating a kind of cold robotic approach that's just grounded in theory, and that's where a lot of harm actually comes from stakeholder engagement strategies where companies are perceived to be distant, perceived to be disconnected, perceived to be cold, and those are red flags on any communication strategy. So when you're dealing with an organization that has low interest and low power, these are the communication strategies around which you should be centering your final strategy on. Remember, no single strategy works. Or no single communication method works. It's a combination of different methods. Okay, and so the one option is to remain passive, where there is no active communication. However, this is strongly discouraged, especially when there are trigger events. And so a constant policy of just remaining passive and not communicating often leads to things like protests, letters of complaint, social media posts. And that can, from a marketing perspective and from a credibility perspective, damage the brand significantly. And so it's very rare that no communication is actually a good communication strategy. We will look at one example later on where refraining from communication actually worked quite well. But remember, in order to take such a bold stance, you need to understand your market and your stakeholders very, very well. And so remaining passive only works in very, very limited contexts, and it's not something that you should consider employing as a business as usual sort of strategy. The next tier centers on monitoring. Okay, and typically this is a one-way communication that's simply monitored by your organization or your company, and the type of practices that this emanates into entails things like monitoring social media trends. Your social media strategists, your marketing managers, they would play a very, very important role in monitoring the kind of dialogue that's taking place on social media, looking for keywords, using appropriate content analysis software, and understanding what are the sentiments, the vibes, the kind of narrative that's being built around your organization on social media. So that would be things like monitoring your Facebook pages very closely, your Instagram pages, and your Twitter pages very, very closely. Identifying and engaging with the type of posts that are coming across, not necessarily responding to them, but getting a sense of what people are saying about your organization. The same goes for your traditional media platforms as well. So depending on how big your organization is and how influential your organization is, listening to the radio, listening to talk shows, listening to interviews, watching how people are engaging with your brand when there are trigger events. Is the public generally in your favor? Are they generally against you? And so understanding the necessary media, understanding the objectives of different media different media strategies and whether they are working in the right context becomes very, very important. Okay. The last step or the last strategy within this quadrant is to advocate. So a little bit more involved than simply monitoring or remaining passive, but still rather subtle in terms of an overall strategy. So typically also a one-way communication form of the organization, but targeted at specific stakeholders. Okay, and so these sort of emanate in proactive attempts to sway expected judgment or a collective stance on an impending matter. So typically within an organization, they know that something is coming up that's going to get public interest, or that's going to get interest from their stakeholders, and in an attempt to shape sentiment before the issue hits communication channels with the stakeholders in a formal way, one would then advocate and try to shape that stance or try to formulate the framework within which those views should be tabled. The next step the next quadrant is to look at those interest groups that have a high interest in your organization, but very little power to do anything about it. And so the type of strategies that you would consider would be very similar to the first quadrant, but a little bit more intense. And so the first strategy one could look at is to inform. Okay, again, one-way communication from the organization on particular issues, but being very clear that there's no invitation for them to engage or reply. So typically this is in the form of bulletins, public letters, in the form of open letters, brochures, reports. So like your annual reports, for example. Um, these sort of information campaigns are ordinarily matched with communication thereafter, but is a standalone strategy. Your annual report, by its nature, for example, doesn't invite reply. Um, what would emerge from there would be discussion, debate, invitation for interviews, etc. And that's where one would then engage in a two-way basis with the right stakeholders. The next step is to transact. And so transacting is slightly more involved in informing, and it now ventures into the two-way communication space. So performance is monitored according to very set terms in the contract. So a transaction takes place between you and your stakeholders, not necessarily a financial transaction, but some sort of interaction where the scope of the interaction is demarcated and clearly set, and the goals of that communication initiative is then tried. You then try to achieve those goals. We then move over into a consultative basis, also a very limited two-way engagement, where the organization asks questions and stakeholders answer. But organizations don't typically then engage with those answers. So it's more of a listening exercise rather than an engagement exercise. And so this is usually done through things like surveys, focus groups, meetings, public meetings, workshops. And so a lot of feedback is not given. The objective is to listen and understand. We then move over into the space where you have those with high levels of power but low interest. And so the idea here is to keep those stakeholders satisfied. They don't really take an interest in your organization on a day-to-day basis, but have significant power in affecting your organization. And so you would follow a very similar approach to what we did in the second quadrant, where we would consider transacting, consulting, but in addition, we would also consider negotiating. And so negotiating typically arises from periodical, or arises through periodical communication, where yourself and the organization or the interest group engage in some sort of negotiation to either maintain the status quo for the foreseeable future, or to make adjustments where necessary. And so a typical example would be collective bargaining when dealing with trade unions. So wage negotiations come up, sometimes annually, sometimes every 2 years, sometimes every 3 years. And so those periodical negotiations then take place, and for the next period, whether it's a year, 2 years, or 3 years, the interest groups are pretty much happy unless there's some sort of major event that takes place. And then lastly, we look at the most important category of stakeholders, which are those that have high power and high interest in what's going on in your organization. And so the level of communication needs to be very, very astute. And so we would consider things like involving yourself directly in the organization or in the stakeholders' activities as well. And it typically emanates in a multi-way engagement. Learning on both sides, engaging at a deeper level, where more than one stakeholder is present, your advisory panels, focus groups, engagement tools, very, very in-depth discussion and analysis takes place, which then often results in collaboration. And so collaboration is when the two organizations sort of engage in a multi-way or on a multi-way basis, and a lot of learning takes place, decision making and actions critically are actually done together. So as opposed to simply being involved with each other, collaborating is taking the next step to put both stamps on action that is taken. And then lastly, which is the most important and the most sophisticated form of engagement, is to empower and enable your interest groups to actually achieve their goals more easily or more broadly. And so when we find our space in the empower category, we're actually dealing with stakeholders from a very important governance and strategy perspective, so that not only their strategic imperatives are being met, not only your strategic imperatives are being met, but you are actively taking an interest in empowering and assisting other stakeholders to achieve their imperatives too. And so that is definitely, the apex of stakeholder engagement, and typically reserved only for those stakeholders that have a very high level of interest in your organization, and matched with that a high level of power to either affect your organization or in some instances be affected by your organization. And so some phenomenal examples that we can look at that come up from the international community. So there's a lot that you can go read about these three cases. I'll just briefly introduce you to them. And so the first one is a campaign that was released by KFC not too long ago. And so in a nutshell, KFC in Ireland in the UK, through a series of events that were really unforeseen, ran out of chicken, and so the restaurants were pretty much unable to provide meals, and you can only imagine walking into a KFC and there's nothing to buy, and so this was a problem that lasted for a few days, and the marketing team, together with senior management, took a very unique stance in avoiding a very cold, a very formal apology, and instead, with a very creative and clever play on letters, issued an apology that went viral, both on social media and in discussion forums. And well, I think if you look at the bucket, it's pretty self-explanatory, and you can go read more about that. But the core of the message was KFC really understood that their market wouldn't respond positively to cold formality, and took a decision that really worked very well for them. And so that's a great example of understanding and knowing your stakeholders and responding appropriately. Another fantastic response that was broadly acknowledged as a good one, despite some criticism, was in 2018 when two black men were arrested in a Starbucks cafe for simply sitting there. And so the response from Starbucks was to immediately close all stores and undertake diversity training at their stores. And although there was some criticism around how genuine that initiative was, by and large, the initiative set very well with what their broader stakeholder groups, and it was seen to be decisive, strong action, which was seen in a very positive light. Another one centers on the athlete in America, Colin Kaepernick, who was protesting through a demonstration of sitting on a knee, and Nike came on board to support the protest action as well, despite all the criticism that was taking place. Immediately following Nike's promotion of this act of protest, there was a lot of negativity out there in the media, and the response from Nike was to actually stay silent and stick behind their initial strategy. And as soon as the dust settled, sales were up, and Nike was seen to be very, very progressive and forward-looking in their political stance around around racial equality, and so in the end it turned out to be an excellent move for the brand, and brand value actually increased quite significantly after that. And so those are really some examples that you can look at. You can Google them and read a little bit more. Very, very interesting content out there. So I would encourage you to take a look. And that brings us to the end of our lecture series. I want to thank you for paying attention and being on this journey with us. There are some exercises that I would encourage you to do in order to better understand stakeholder engagement from your organization's perspective. And with that, I wish you the very best of luck and hope to see you soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.